on Goblin Reddit. Today's story is...
My millionaire grandfather radically changed his attitude and disinherited the whole family. 2 months before he died, on the day of the funeral, no one imagined the cunning trap he had prepared. My grandfather Roger had been fighting an illness for several years. Nowadays, he can hardly get out of bed and needs constant supervision. At the beginning of the year, the doctors gave him less than 12 months to live, and they weren't the kind of people who are usually wrong with these prognoses. They told us that even if he managed to make it to the end of the year, it would be practically a miracle, let alone living any longer. Surprisingly, this news did not seem to sadden him. My grandfather had always been an extremely positive and affectionate person, always cheerful and with the ability to transmit that happiness to those around him. That's why his sudden change in attitude was so disconcerting to me. My grandparents raised me from a young age. My parents died when I was very young, so much so that I don't have a single memory of them. I have only seen them in photographs. I sometimes think about them, but I can't say that I really miss them. My grandparents provided me with a wonderful life. My grandparents have a considerable fortune, but I don't include this as part of my identity. This is because my grandfather decided to raise me differently to other members of the family. He wanted me to be independent of his fortune. So although they paid for everything I needed, they never gave me an excessively luxurious lifestyle. I think it was an excellent decision, because I probably would not have developed the same respect for money and hard work if I had been raised in a different way. Although many family members consider me unfortunate for not having direct access to the family wealth, I have never minded. Unlike them, I have never coveted my grandfather's money. Before his health deteriorated considerably, I planned to become independent. My grandmother passed away about 4 years ago, and a few months later I was due to leave for university. Naturally, I was worried about leaving my grandfather alone, knowing how difficult it had been for him to lose my grandmother, but he smiled at me and explained that he was too old to be sad about death for a long time. He told me that he had spent more than 6 decades with my grandmother, and that he considered himself lucky to have had her by his side. The only reason for his sadness was that he had always told her that he would die first, so that he wouldn't have to say goodbye. This conversation was both moving and heartbreaking. My grandfather insisted that I didn't stay at home, so I left for university. About a year ago, I graduated and started working as an intern. I was focused on my professional life, but I still visited him periodically. When his health worsened significantly, I returned to take care of him. My grandfather tried to dissuade me, telling me that he had hired staff for that task, but I didn't listen to him. I changed jobs and moved closer to his house. Since then, I have been looking after him, and until a few months ago, everything was going relatively well. Of course, my grandfather has other relatives, but most of them are only interested in his fortune. A large part of the family is still financially dependent on him, but despite needing that support, they are not concerned enough to visit him occasionally. However, since his health began to deteriorate, more and more relatives have started to show up, pretending to be concerned. I don't like to say it, but many are simply waiting for him to die so they can claim their share of the inheritance. Numerous relatives, including my uncle, my grandfather's youngest son, lie to him and steal money from him, something I have discovered on multiple occasions. But I have never told him. My grandfather loves everyone equally and always helps when someone is in difficulty. He doesn't care if they are lying to him. Money is not his priority. He can see clearly that many relatives only care about him because of his wealth, but he doesn't seem to mind. He loves his whole family unconditionally. That's why, when I discovered that some of them were lying and stealing from him, I didn't say anything, as I anticipated the response I would get. Initially, I feared that knowing the truth would break his heart, but then I realized that my grandfather wasn't naive enough not to realize that some relatives were clearly trying to take advantage of him. He just didn't care enough about his family using his money. One day, when I returned from work, I overheard my Uncle Jim and my Aunt Sophie plotting something. They were discussing how they could pretend to be more affectionate and important than the other relatives. In particular, they wanted my grandfather to value them more than me. I went over and told them they didn't need to do all that. The only thing necessary was to genuinely care for their father, who wouldn't be alive for much longer. Jim became furious and told me that I wasn't old enough to talk to him that way, and he also accused me of wanting the same thing from Grandpa. I replied that our intentions were different and that my grandfather wouldn't favor some over others. He had always been fair to everyone, And I mention this because, like Jim and Sophie, many relatives feel jealous thinking that Grandpa loves me more than them. Although this is not necessarily true, some have tried to harm me with lies. However, my grandfather never believed these falsehoods, as he trusts me completely. That's why I was so surprised by his behavior over the past 2 months. I have no idea what happened or if someone interfered. It all started when I had to travel for a few days for work. I tried to contact a relative to visit my grandfather, but he insisted that he would be fine, so I left. When I returned and went to see him, he was extremely rude to me. He asked me not to visit him anymore, and although I tried to find out what had happened, he wouldn't listen to me and asked me to leave. I had never seen my grandfather behave like that, especially towards me. I returned home and tried to talk to him the next day, hoping he would have calmed down. I suspected that a family member had interfered negatively. However, the next day, his attitude was identical. He was angry and refused to talk about the subject. When I insisted, he threw me out of his house and cut off our relationship. Furious, I contacted my uncle, convinced that he or another family member was responsible for this change. But what I discovered was even stranger, considering my grandfather's personality. It turned out that he had cut off all contact with the family. He didn't want to talk to any of them. My Uncle Jim thought I had caused all this, but when he learned that he had also distanced himself from me, he was speechless. Jim asked me if Granddad had lost his mind, but that seemed unlikely as he was being monitored practically 24 hours a day. If something significant had happened, I would have heard about it. I asked all the staff at the home, but no one had any idea what had triggered this behavior. However, the worst was yet to come. Yesterday, I managed to talk to my grandfather, and his words are still ringing in my ears. Ever since he pushed me away, I had tried to communicate with him, but he kept rejecting me. He constantly told me that he didn't want to see me, but yesterday, he finally allowed me into his room. I asked him what was going on and how I could help. He replied that he was pushing everyone away because that was what he wanted. He said he no longer wanted a family like ours. I reminded him that just 2 months ago he loved us all equally, and he replied that this feeling had changed. I told him he couldn't do that we were his family. He replied that he no longer considered us as such. He said it with a completely serious expression. Immediately, my eyes filled with tears. I asked him if he was losing his mind, and he assured me that he was perfectly well mentally, and he threw me out again. But before I left, he asked me to inform everyone that no one would receive his inheritance. I have not shared this information with anyone because it would cause absolute chaos. I cannot understand what is happening to my grandfather or how to handle this situation. If there is no physical condition causing this behavior, I think he may be acting this way because he feels he has little time left. Perhaps he is angry at feeling his life is coming to an end. It is difficult to understand what is going through his mind at the moment. No one in the family has experienced anything similar, for obvious reasons, so we cannot understand it. Update 1. Several months have passed since my initial post. I wanted to thank you and share an update, but life sometimes keeps us too busy. Unfortunately, this update does not bring good news. During this time, even after my grandfather told me that he no longer considered me part of his family, I continued to try to find out what was happening. His words devastated me, but I couldn't give up. I loved him too much, so I kept trying to get closer, but he refused to let me into his house after our last conversation. My grandfather's health was deteriorating day by day, and I feared he would die soon. When my Uncle Jim found out that Grandpa wouldn't leave anything to anyone, not even to me, he decided to inform everyone else. When we talked about it, I asked him to keep the information secret temporarily, as we didn't really know if it was final. He told me that Grandpa himself had confirmed that no one would receive anything, and asked me if I had anything to do with it. I assured him that I was not involved at all, and that I was trying to calm my grandfather down so that he would be his usual self again. I begged him not to divulge the information, but he did what he wanted. As expected, as soon as the relatives most interested in the inheritance found out, their reaction was extreme. Some refused to believe it, while others went directly to beg their grandfather, arguing that they had done nothing wrong. However, they quickly discovered that my grandfather would not change his mind. Many asked me if I was worried about the inheritance. As I mentioned, I have never been too concerned about money, as I was raised to be self-sufficient. Since leaving university, I have not used a single penny of my grandfather's money, so the inheritance does not mean much to me. However, it clearly means everything to my relatives. They tried to convince Granddad to change his mind, but they failed. In about 2 months, they also realized that there was no way he would change his position. My Uncle Jim kept insisting that I do something, but I explained that I had already tried everything to restore my relationship with him without success, so getting him to reconsider the inheritance issue seemed virtually impossible. I was convinced that, with time, my grandfather's anger would dissipate and he would return to his usual self, so I waited patiently. But he didn't change. Last night, he passed away in his sleep. I didn't even get to say goodbye, even though I had known for some time that he wouldn't live much longer. I had been preparing myself mentally to live without him, but I never imagined that I wouldn't even have the chance to say goodbye. It is ironic that all the other family members seemed more devastated than I was upon hearing of his passing. All these people who never truly cared for him were heartbroken, not because they had lost my grandfather, but because they had lost their chance to receive his fortune. Their sadness outweighs mine, but for completely the wrong reasons. It seems clear that my grandfather did not change his mind before he died. As I understand it, he left his entire fortune to various charities, which is really a good thing. I just wish he had been his old self again, at least during his last days. I really wanted to talk to him and get his advice before he passed away. It pains me to think that our last conversation was an argument where he told me he no longer considered me part of his family. So that's all that happened, and now I'm organizing the funeral. However, none of the family want to help. They're all angry with my grandfather, and in a way I understand why, but I hope they can forgive him and help. I miss my grandfather deeply. I wish I could have convinced him to tell me what really happened. Update 2. This time, it hasn't taken me so long to return with news. 2 days have passed and the funeral will be held tomorrow. The only problem is that no member of my family will be attending. They are so angry with Grandpa that they don't even want to come to his funeral to show a minimum of respect. After my last update, I have been very busy with the funeral arrangements, and believe me, it has been really complicated. It was especially difficult because none of my relatives were willing to help me. I had to personally take care of most of the planning and arrangements, with only a few hired people providing assistance. I have already called and pleaded with them, but they all flatly refused to do anything for Grandpa. For them, he has become the villain who left them with nothing. I knew from the start that most of the relatives did not have genuine affection for my grandfather, but this demonstration that they were only interested in his money is excessive. My grandfather is the reason why they have all had comfortable lives, but they have stopped valuing that and only focus on the lost inheritance. Although all the members of my family have refused to help or attend the funeral, there will still be numerous attendees. My grandfather was a well-known person who cultivated many friendships throughout his life. With so many friends, I obviously wanted to organize a ceremony that my grandfather could be proud of. I haven't had much help, but I've done my best, and I think Grandpa would be pleased with my efforts. We had talked many times about funerals, and he always told me how he would like his to be. He didn't want it to be an overly sad event, and wanted people to remember him with joy. That's how it will be tomorrow. All his friends and acquaintances will be there, and the only ones absent will be his so-called relatives. Although, for my grandfather, I think his real family was made up of the people who will be there tomorrow. Naturally, I didn't want it to happen like this. I already called Jim and begged him to come to the funeral. I reminded him that he was his own father and that, regardless of everything, he deserved to have his son present. He replied that Roger was no longer his father and that he hated him. I spoke to many other relatives and received similar responses. They all claimed to hate Grandpa and flatly refused to attend the funeral. Many asked me if they would receive any financial compensation for attending, and I told them what the lawyer had told me during the organization of the funeral. The lawyer explained to me that they would receive nothing, even if they participated in these acts. I insisted that not everything was reduced to monetary issues. As the family already knew that the grandfather had left them nothing, they had no motivation to show up. I pleaded with them. I explained that Grandpa would have liked to see his whole family at his funeral. They replied that they would prefer it if it wasn't like that. They didn't want to have anything to do with that man. I tried my hardest, but I couldn't convince anyone to attend. I will probably be the only family member present at the funeral. I am deeply saddened by this situation, but I cannot change their way of thinking. Update 3. The funeral took place yesterday, and I have some important news to share. I have been looking forward to sitting down to write this for some time. For most of the ceremony, I was extremely busy dealing with all the details. I kept hoping that at least some of the family would turn up, but they didn't. No one from the family, apart from me, attended the funeral, although many other people who loved and respected Granddad did turn up. This made the experience less lonely, and I was glad to see so many people who really cared about him sharing positive memories. I gave a short speech about how much I loved him and what he meant to me. I also tried to justify my family's absence whenever anyone asked about them, but inside I was deeply disappointed, as their absence showed that no one really cared about him. However, it turns out that my grandfather was much more astute than I imagined, something that became clear after the funeral. My grandfather's lawyer announced that he had an important announcement. Microphone in hand, he revealed that my grandfather had requested that this announcement be made after everything had been concluded. The lawyer explained that many months ago, on the very weekend that I was away on business, my grandfather had contacted him to ask him something unusual. He had told him that he wished to change his will. Grandfather asked him to change the provisions, stating that only close relatives who attended his funeral could receive his fortune. The estate would be divided equally among all family members in attendance, and if no one did, everything would go to charity. A percentage of the total would still go to charity, regardless of the number of attendees. So the reason my grandfather behaved that way with everyone was to determine who really loved him and who didn't. He wanted to make sure that his wealth benefited those family members who truly cared about him. When I understood what he had done, I wondered when he had planned all this. I felt somewhat offended that he had decided to test my affection for him as well. He wanted to evaluate everyone on an equal footing, but he could have been less harsh on me. As I pondered this, I noticed that everyone was looking at me, including the lawyer. Then I understood the situation. I was the only direct member of the family present. The lawyer added, a person in whom Roger trusted, and he was happy that he had not been mistaken. He then explained that, as the grandfather had stipulated, his entire fortune would be divided among the family members present. I looked around and said, "I'm the only one here." The lawyer replied, "Well, that means there's nothing to divide, does it? Everything my grandfather owned now belongs to me, or at least will be mine soon." I couldn't believe it and said that I couldn't accept so much money. He replied, quote, "That's what Roger wanted. It's stipulated in the will. By now the news has spread, and soon all the relatives will find out. I'm sure they will think I deliberately orchestrated all this, even though I begged them all to attend. I have turned off my phone because I anticipated what is to come. Endless days of calls from relatives demanding their share." Finally, the lawyer gave me a letter that my grandfather left for me, but I haven't read it yet. I'm still a bit upset that he did all this, even to me. Why didn't he just tell me the truth? He knew perfectly well that money has never mattered to me. Update 4. I must update you on what has happened in the last 2 months. As I anticipated, just one day after my last update, everyone had already found out and was trying to contact me incessantly. As I predicted, my family was convinced that I had used some strategy to get my grandfather to leave me everything. I didn't even try to explain to them, because I knew that no one would listen to me. I simply disconnected my phone. A few hours after my last update, I decided to read the letter my grandfather left me. The first part expressed how proud he was of me and the kind of life he wanted for me, so I will treasure that section. He then explained how he knew I would be angry with him for his strategy, but that he wanted to be fair. That's why he decided to include me in the test, even though I really had nothing to prove to him. He apologized for playing with my feelings in that way and asked my forgiveness for not allowing me to say goodbye. He also asked me not to be sad. He left me some advice and told me that, no matter how many relatives asked me for money, I should never, under any circumstances, share what I had received from him. The money was intended for those who deserved it, and even if it was only me, he didn't want me to share it. Furthermore, regardless of how many people insisted, he wanted me to live in our house. In the letter, he asked me to move there. He also explained another reason why he decided to keep me at a distance during his last days. He mentioned that while he felt sick, I would not live fully, because I would be constantly by his side. Besides, he did not like goodbyes, and did not want to have one with me. As I read all the positive things he had to say about me, he finally said goodbye. He wished me a long and happy life, and I experienced conflicting emotions as I read it, expressing itself normally again, because I had been longing to see something like this before his departure. The next day, my Uncle Jim was the first to turn up to confront me. He asked me how I had managed it, and I explained that I hadn't done anything at all. It was Granddad's will, and he had given everyone a fair chance to get a share of his fortune. I reminded him that he and the other relatives were the ones who had failed the test. This made him completely furious. I reminded him that I had begged him, and many others, to help or at least attend the funeral, but they had rejected Grandfather. Then I asked him to stop bothering me, and he left. Other relatives continued to harass me for money, but I maintained my stance of ignoring them. I later moved into Grandpa's house, and the family began to show up continuously, demanding what they called justice. They spread rumors that I had stolen his rightful wealth by manipulating Grandpa. They tried to get other friends and family to take their side and paint me as the antagonist. I asked some of my grandfather's trusted employees to carry out an exhaustive investigation into the members of the family who had stolen from him, and there were many. As a result, I dismissed them from the positions my grandfather had provided for them and stopped payments to those who were still receiving money from him. I completely cut off the whole family from any financial support they were receiving from my grandfather, which intensified their anger. They did everything they could to fight these decisions, but it was useless. I had every right to act on my own judgment, but all these measures were taken exclusively to honor my grandfather's wishes. I am not interested in the money itself. The family tried to file a lawsuit against me to get what they considered their share, but they only wasted time and resources. My grandfather made sure that nobody could take the money away from those who received it, although he probably didn't anticipate that I would be the sole beneficiary. A week ago, many relatives, including Jim, Sophie, and others, came to beg me for help because they had no jobs and no resources and were in a desperate situation. They promised to do anything if I helped them and swore never to steal from the family businesses again. At that moment, I decided that I would offer them help in the style of my grandfather, but not in a way that would please them. I gave them jobs, but not the same ones they had before. I assigned most of the family members to basic jobs that require considerable physical effort so that they would understand the value of money. They had no choice but to accept, and now many of them are working hard. They hate it, but they have no choice, and obviously I'm not giving them money. The people they stole from are working twice as hard as they did before for the same pay. I think it's an excellent educational strategy. They are learning the value of every hard-earned dollar, and I think Grandpa would have loved to see it. I just hope I have honored his wishes properly. I really miss him immensely. Update 5. This update is necessary to inform you about the situation of my relatives lately, especially those who got jobs thanks to me. I recognize that not everyone approved of my decision to offer work to people who perhaps did not deserve it. However, this was part of a broader plan that has now proven effective. Furthermore, if any of the relatives had proven their worth as workers, even if the positions were not extraordinary, they could have redeemed themselves. It was their chance, although I anticipate that they did not take advantage of this possibility. I always sensed that my relatives would eventually reveal their true nature, and gradually this happened. Some resigned quickly. I suppose they hoped to get their old privileged jobs back. However, I never promised them that, only the chance to learn the value of hard work. So they resigned to look for other alternatives. However, those who have found other jobs have not significantly improved their situation compared to what I offered them, while others have not even found work. The rest have been dismissed. Currently, there are no family members left in employment. The reasons for dismissal have been new attempts at misappropriation, with the difference that there was now constant supervision. When they tried, immediate action was taken, and legal action has even been taken against these people, leaving them in a worse situation than when they arrived. The relatives, who desperately needed financial resources, cannot even work honestly, even though their subsistence depends on it. The test that my grandfather designed now makes more sense, because if he had left money for them, they would currently be a group of people with a sense of privilege and plenty of free time.